James was a quiet man, someone who preferred to keep to himself. On this chilly autumn morning, he found himself walking down the busy street, his old boots scraping against the pavement with each step. His coat, thick and worn from years of use, was wrapped tightly around him, but it didn't do much to block the cold wind that seemed to bite right through. He felt the weight of the world with every step, but he kept walking, one foot in front of the other. It had been a tough few months. Not too long ago, James had a good life. He worked as an engineer, living comfortably with a steady job, a nice apartment, and friends to share meals with. But everything had changed after the fire. The fire that destroyed his home, the fire that destroyed his career, and the fire that changed his life forever. Now James found himself without a permanent place to stay, bouncing from shelter to shelter, never staying in one place too long. This morning, however, he didn't need to worry about where to sleep. He had made a small plan. There was a cafe just a few blocks ahead where he hoped to get a cup of coffee, something warm to hold in his hands. It wasn't much, but it was something. He had a few coins left in his pocket, just enough for a simple coffee. Maybe if he sat there for a little while, he could forget about everything for a moment. He could pretend, even just for a few minutes, that life was normal again. As he approached the cafe, the warm smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air, and James couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but the smell of coffee was comforting, like a little piece of the life he had lost. The cafe was cozy, with soft light spilling out from the windows, and a handful of people were sitting inside, enjoying their drinks and chatting quietly. James glanced around, wondering if anyone would notice him, but he pushed the thought aside. He just needed a moment of warmth. He opened the door and stepped inside. The bell above the door rang, and the warmth of the cafe rushed over him. His eyes scanned the room. There were a few tables occupied, with people focused on their laptops or talking in hushed voices. James stood in line, his hands still cold despite the coat. He could feel the eyes of the others in the cafe, some glancing at him and then quickly looking away. It wasn't new. It happened often. People saw him, the man with the old coat and the tired eyes, and made their judgments without saying a word. When it was his turn, James stepped up to the counter. The barista, a young woman with a smile that seemed practiced, looked at him with a raised eyebrow. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. James hesitated, his voice quiet as he asked for a simple coffee. The barista nodded, but something in her expression made James feel uncomfortable. He wasn't sure if it was the way she glanced at his coat or the way she stood a little straighter. It didn't matter much. He just wanted the coffee, a small comfort to get him through the day. As he waited, he looked around the cafe once more. The warmth, the quiet chatter, the soft clink of cups. It was a peaceful place, but he wasn't sure if he belonged here anymore. James stood quietly by the counter, watching as the barista prepared the coffee. The steam rising from the machine was a small comfort, like a promise that something simple could still bring warmth. He reached into his pocket, feeling the cold coins as he prepared to pay for his drink. The sounds of the cafe, the quiet hum of the espresso machine, the soft chatter of customers, the occasional clink of a spoon against a cup, filled the air, creating an atmosphere that almost made James feel normal again, even if just for a few moments. He had just enough money for the coffee. Nothing fancy, just a regular cup. Nothing that would make him stand out. He had learned over time to keep things simple. People didn't like complicated. People didn't like to notice others too much. But today, something felt different. As he waited for his coffee, James could feel the stares. He tried not to look around too much, but it was hard to ignore. A man sitting at a nearby table whispered something to his friend, his eyes flicking in James' direction. James didn't need to hear the words to know what was being said. It wasn't the first time. It wasn't the first time people looked at him like he didn't belong. The barista finally handed him his coffee. "That'll be $2.50, she said, her voice colder now, more businesslike than before. James reached into his pocket, pulling out the crumpled bills, counting them carefully as he placed the exact change on the counter. The barista's eyes flicked down to the money, then back up to his face. There was no smile this time. She didn't even say thank you. She simply turned away, preparing the next order without a word. James took the cup in his hands, feeling the heat of it through the paper. It wasn't much, but it was something. He moved to find a seat, looking around the room. There was an empty table near the window, but as he started to walk toward it, he felt a hand on his arm. He turned, surprised. "Excuse me." The manager's voice was sharp, his face stern. "You can't sit here. We don't allow people like you to loiter in the cafe." James blinked, confused. "I'm just here for a coffee," he said, his voice quiet. "I'll sit quietly." The manager shook his head, his expression unmoved. "I'm sorry, but you need to leave. We can't have you here looking like that. It's not appropriate." James's heart sank. He had hoped for a little kindness, maybe just a moment to escape the cold world outside. But the manager's words felt like a punch. He wasn't welcome. He wasn't wanted. Feeling his face flush with embarrassment, James took a small step back. He didn't argue. There was no point. He had learned over the years that arguing with people like this never got him anywhere. So, without another word, he turned and left the cafe, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Outside, the cold hit him again. The warmth from the coffee was already starting to fade as he walked back onto the street, unsure of where to go next. He didn't know why it still hurt. After everything he had been through, this should have been just another moment. But it wasn't. It felt like a reminder that he was no longer part of the world he once knew. James walked slowly down the street, his footsteps muffled by the cold pavement beneath him. His hands were wrapped tightly around the coffee cup, trying to hold on to the warmth for as long as he could. But with each step, the heat from the cup seemed to slip away, replaced by the biting cold of the morning air. He tried not to let it bother him, but it was hard not to notice. It was always like this, always cold, always distant, always a feeling of being on the outside. He walked past the same old shops he had seen every day, the bright windows showcasing things he no longer cared about. Clothes, electronics, food, things that no longer seemed important to him. Things that felt out of reach. He wasn't hungry. He didn't need anything. All he wanted was to keep moving, to forget the stares, to forget the way the manager had kicked him out of the cafe. James tried to focus on the rhythm of his footsteps, the sound of his boots tapping against the pavement. He tried to focus on the simple act of walking, on the few moments when his mind didn't have to be tangled in memories or worries. But it was hard to escape the feeling of being invisible, of being something less than the people who passed him by. No one saw him, and even when they didn't look at him the way they looked at others. He turned a corner, passing through a narrow alley between two buildings. The street was quieter here, more isolated. It was where he usually went when he needed a moment alone, a place where he could sit and think without the eyes of the world watching him. He didn't always sleep here, but it was a good spot to rest for a little while, a small break from the world that seemed to keep moving faster and faster. James leaned against the cold brick wall of the alley and took a long sip of his coffee. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. He looked up at the sky, the gray clouds hanging low, like they were hiding something. The city felt distant in that moment, like it was too far away to reach. Everything felt distant, his past, his future, the person he used to be. Everything was out of his grasp. As he sat there, he noticed something strange. The alley, usually quiet and peaceful, was filled with the sound of distant voices. Not the usual sounds of traffic or city life, but something else, voices that seemed hurried, tense. He could hear the muffled sound of people speaking quickly, their words blending together. Something was happening, but James couldn't quite tell what. He stood up, curiosity pulling him toward the street. As he walked toward the end of the alley, he saw a group of people gathered on the corner, all talking at once. Their faces were serious, and some were even looking up at the sky. James squinted, trying to make sense of what was going on. In the distance, he saw the flashing lights of police cars and the unmistakable hum of emergency vehicles. Something big was happening, but he had no idea what. He felt a strange tension in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Whatever it was, it seemed important. He took a step back, deciding to stay out of the way for now. But a part of him, the part that had been invisible for so long, couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, whatever was happening could change things, change everything. As night fell, James found himself standing at the edge of the alley, watching the scene unfold in the distance. The flashing lights from police cars and emergency vehicles lit up the street in strange, colorful patterns, like a twisted celebration. Something big was happening. He could feel the tension in the air, like the whole city was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. He stood there for a few moments, unsure of what to do. Part of him wanted to move closer, to find out what was going on. But another part of him wanted to stay hidden, to avoid being caught in something he didn't understand. He had learned a long time ago that it was better to keep to the shadows. It was safer that way. As he watched the lights, James felt a wave of unease wash over him. The streets, normally filled with the hum of city life, were eerily quiet. The usual sounds, the laughter, the chatter, the distant roar of traffic were all muted. Now all he could hear were the sirens and the occasional shouted command from the people near the emergency vehicles. Something had happened, something serious. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting someone to notice him standing there, but the alley was as empty as it had been before. The only company he had was the cold wind that seemed to be picking up, swirling around him as if urging him to leave. But James didn't want to leave. Not yet. As he stood there, trying to make sense of the situation, he noticed movement in the distance. A group of people, dressed in dark clothes, were walking quickly towards the scene. They were focused, their faces grim. James could hear bits and pieces of their conversation as they passed, their voices low but filled with urgency. "It's happening tonight, then," one of them said, his voice tinged with fear. "We can't wait any longer." Another voice, a woman's, responded. "We'll do what we have to. The warning's clear." James didn't understand what they were talking about, but the tone in their voices sent a chill down his spine. Whatever was happening, it wasn't something normal. It wasn't something people should be talking about in such a serious way. He had a strange feeling that whatever this was, it was only the beginning. As the group of people disappeared into the crowd near the emergency vehicles, James took a step back into the shadows. His heart was racing now, his breath coming in short bursts. He had no idea what he had just overheard, but it felt important. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled into something much bigger than he could understand. He stood there for a while longer, watching the streets, waiting for something to happen. But the longer he waited, the more the city felt like it was closing in on him. He wanted to go back to the quiet alley, to find a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach him. But a part of him knew he couldn't. Not now, not with the way things were unfolding around him. As the night wore on, James felt a sense of unease settle deep in his stomach. Whatever was happening, it was only going to get worse before it got better. He wasn't sure what his role in all of this would be, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't walk away. The world had changed, and James was right in the middle of it. The next morning, James woke up to the sound of distant engines rumbling through the streets. It was still early, and the world was still dim with the first light of dawn. He blinked, feeling the cold air against his face as he slowly sat up in the alley, his body stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the fog of sleep from his mind. The noise was getting louder now, and he could hear the low hum of trucks moving through the streets. James stood up, his legs aching as he stretched. The alley seemed quieter today, like even the city was holding its breath. Something felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened the night before was only the beginning. He pulled his coat tighter around him and made his way to the mouth of the alley, peering out onto the street. The sight that greeted him was nothing like the usual morning rush. There were no people rushing to work, no cars honking, no usual hustle of the city. Instead, there were army trucks parked at every corner, blocking intersections and creating a barricade that seemed to stretch for miles. Soldiers in dark uniforms moved between the vehicles, their faces serious, their movements purposeful. The street was eerily quiet, like the calm before a storm. James's heart began to race as he stepped out into the street, careful not to draw attention to himself. He had no idea what was going on, but it was clear something serious had happened. The army trucks and the soldiers were a sign that things were no longer normal. He tried to keep his distance, slipping between the shadows, but his curiosity was getting the best of him. As he moved closer to one of the trucks, James overheard a conversation between two soldiers. Their voices were low, but he could make out the words. "They're locking down the area. Nothing gets in or out," one soldier said, his voice filled with a quiet urgency. "Do you think they'll find it today?" the other soldier asked, his voice tense. "I don't know, but they're not taking any chances." James's mind raced. He didn't know exactly what they were talking about, but it didn't sound good. He had heard rumors about something happening in the city, something big, but he hadn't known what. Now, with the streets blocked off and the army setting up their barricades, he realized this was far more serious than he had imagined. He backed away slowly, trying to stay out of sight. He wasn't involved in whatever was going on, but he couldn't ignore the sense of danger that hung in the air. The street felt different now, more like a war zone than the bustling city it had been the day before. James knew he had to be careful. The last thing he wanted was to get caught up in something he didn't understand. As he walked down the sidewalk, he could feel the eyes of the soldiers on him, even though they didn't look directly at him. They were too focused on their task, too focused on the area around them to notice a man in an old coat. But James couldn't shake the feeling that the city was no longer a place where he belonged. It had changed overnight, and so had he. Whatever was happening, it was only going to get worse from here. The streets were still quiet, but the tension had only grown since the night before. James walked quickly, his steps echoing in the stillness. Army trucks blocked every intersection, and soldiers moved in groups, scanning the area with sharp, watchful eyes. The city, once full of noise and movement, now felt like a place frozen in time, trapped in a strange, uncertain stillness. As James walked, he tried to avoid the soldiers, not wanting to attract any attention. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he had a feeling it was more than just a routine military operation. The soldiers seemed tense, alert, like they were preparing for something that was about to happen. Whatever it was, it felt important, and James wasn't sure if he wanted to be caught in the middle of it. He ducked into a small side street, hoping to stay out of sight. The street was narrow and quiet, with only a few windows lit up in the buildings above. It seemed like a good place to collect his thoughts. James had never liked feeling like an outsider, but lately, that's all he had felt. The city, the people, the life he once had, all of it seemed like it belonged to someone else now. He was just an observer, someone passing through. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything. The army trucks, the soldiers, the sense of urgency in the air. It all pointed to something bigger, something he couldn't ignore. He knew that he couldn't just keep walking through the streets like everything was normal. Something had changed, and he was caught in the middle of it. James stopped walking and leaned against the side of a building, trying to blend in with the shadows. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cool breeze brush against his face. It was hard to focus, his thoughts spinning in different directions. What did the soldiers know? What were they looking for? He couldn't shake the feeling that the city had become a place he didn't understand anymore. He wasn't sure if he belonged here, if he even had a place to go back to. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. He froze, his heart racing. He didn't want to get caught by anyone, especially not the soldiers. He quickly moved to the edge of the building, pressing himself against the wall. His breath came in slow, steady bursts as he waited for the footsteps to pass. The footsteps grew louder, then suddenly stopped. James's heart skipped a beat. He held his breath, hoping that whoever it was wouldn't turn the corner and see him. For a moment, everything seemed to hold still. Then, just as quickly as the footsteps had stopped, they began again, moving further down the street. James let out a quiet sigh of relief. He waited for a few moments longer before slowly moving out of the shadow. His mind was still racing, but he knew he couldn't stay here forever. He had to figure out what was going on, even if it meant stepping out of his comfort zone. Whatever was happening in the city, it was getting closer, and he didn't want to be left in the dark. He turned back to the street, taking one careful step after another. The world around him was changing, and he could either watch it happen or try to understand it. And James wasn't the type to just watch. James kept walking, his steps slow and cautious as he made his way down the narrow streets. The city around him seemed to grow quieter with each passing moment. The usual noise of cars and people were replaced by the distant hum of the army trucks. Soldiers were stationed at every corner, scanning the area with intense focus. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a feeling that something big was about to unfold. As James passed by another street corner, he noticed a group of soldiers huddled together, speaking in low voices. He couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but the tension in their body language was impossible to ignore. They were discussing something serious, something that seemed to involve the whole city. James's curiosity got the best of him, and he found himself lingering a little too long. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to keep his distance while still listening carefully. Just as he was about to move on, a loud sound cut through the air, a heavy clang of metal, followed by shouting. James froze, his heart pounding in his chest. It was coming from the other side of the street. He turned and saw a large metal gate at the end of the block, a gate he had never noticed before. It wasn't there the day before, at least not in the same way. It looked brand new, and its presence made everything feel even more unnatural. The soldiers near the gate seemed to be growing more frantic, and James could see flashes of movement as they scrambled to secure it. Curious and uneasy, James stepped closer, trying to stay hidden in the shadows of the buildings. As he neared the gate, he saw something even stranger. There were people, dozens of them, standing in line behind the gate. Their faces were hidden in the shadows, but their stillness made them stand out even more. They looked like they were waiting for something, but James couldn't tell what. A soldier approached the gate, his face grim. He exchanged a few quick words with another soldier before he began to unlock it. The sound of the lock clicking open made James's heart race. Something was about to happen, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The gate creaked open slowly, revealing the people who had been standing behind it. As they stepped through, James noticed that they weren't looking around, weren't reacting to the soldiers or the barricades around them. They moved like a group of people who had accepted their fate, as if they were already resigned to whatever was coming next. James stepped back, his thoughts racing. He had no idea what was going on, but he knew one thing for certain. This was bigger than just a simple lockdown. This wasn't just the army keeping the peace. There was something more at play, something that involved these people and the soldiers working together in a way that felt wrong, like they were all caught in a game they didn't understand. He stood there, hidden in the shadows, watching as the group moved toward the trucks. The world around him felt like it was shifting, changing into something unfamiliar. James wanted to stay hidden, but he couldn't help himself. He had to know more. Whatever this was, it was only the beginning, and James was about to be caught right in the middle of it. The air felt thick with uncertainty as James stood at the edge of the street, watching the group of people move closer to the waiting army trucks. The soldiers were standing in formation, their eyes scanning the crowd, but there was no sign of resistance. It was as if the people were going along with whatever was happening, following the soldiers without question. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Everything about this situation seemed wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on why. He remained hidden in the shadows, his body tense, trying to make sense of what he was witnessing. He had never seen anything like this before. It wasn't just a military operation. It was something bigger, something more controlled. The people who had lined up behind the gate weren't just bystanders. They were part of something, and whatever it wasn't good. As he watched the group shuffle towards the trucks, James noticed one woman in particular. She was in the middle of the crowd, her face hidden beneath the hood, but there was something about the way she moved that caught his attention. She seemed different from the others. She didn't look resigned or passive. Instead, she looked alert, like she was scanning the area, looking for something or someone. James felt a pull, an instinct to follow her. Without thinking, he stepped out of the shadows and moved quietly through the alleyways, keeping his distance from the group. He didn't know why, but he felt that she knew more than anyone else. She might be the key to understanding what was happening. The group reached the trucks, and the soldiers began ushering them inside. It was clear now that the people weren't just being gathered, they were being transported somewhere. James felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. Where were they being taken? What was the purpose of all this? He kept his eyes locked on the woman as she stepped towards one of the trucks. The moment she climbed in, James hurried to the back of the truck, staying out of sight. He didn't know what he was going to do once he was inside, but he couldn't let this opportunity slip away. The truck's engine roared to life, and James could feel the vibrations under his feet as it began to move. He held his breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The truck rumbled down the street, its wheels turning steadily, and James couldn't help but wonder where it was heading. Where were they taking these people? As the truck drove further away from the city center, James' mind raced. He had no idea what he was getting into, but he couldn't turn back now. He had already come this far, and there was no turning back. Whatever was happening, it was something big, and James was right in the middle of it. The city had changed overnight, and with every passing moment, he was getting closer to uncovering the truth. He glanced around at the other faces in the truck, all silent, all looking straight ahead, like they were waiting for something. The woman he had followed was still sitting near the middle, her eyes scanning the road ahead. James watched her closely, wondering what she knew, what she had seen. He had made his choice. He would follow this through, no matter where it led.